My name's Faye and I'm a PhD student. Today, I want to talk to you about how to survive your PhD. I've not posted anything for the last half year, and that is because I've been in the last throes of trying to finish my PhD, which has not always been enjoyable. And maybe you're considering starting a PhD, or you've already been lucky enough to score a spot somewhere, you found funding and are sort of struggling with your early phases, because I've been there. So, although this video, strictly speaking, isn't about books I've been loving, two things to read on this topic I still want to recommend. The first is an article published last year in 2017, which was called Work, Organisation and Mental Health in PhD Students. And this was published by, I think, an international team, but the research was done in Belgium. And basically they concluded that PhD students were significantly more likely to suffer from psychiatric disorders, especially depression, than the general public, employees outside of academia that were highly educated, and other students. So they tried to compare it to groups that made sense in some way, that shared certain variables with PhD students, and despite that still found PhD students, they were in a rough spot. So reading this article just recently, because so far I just sort of skimmed over it and didn't want to get even more depressed in my current situation, I did find it really interesting to see which variables they said mattered the most in predicting why these students were feeling so crap, basically. So I thought, as a way to help you consider how you can get out of a funk, or probably even better, ensure that these variables fit your lifestyle and will hopefully not result in some major self-doubt and depressive episode during your PhD, I thought I'd just talk about some of them. So, one of the variables that they said was really important in determining how the PhD students felt was the balance between their work and their family demands. Now, for me personally, this hasn't been that much of an issue. I don't have kids. For quite a considerable chunk of my PhD, my boyfriend and I were in a long distance relationship, which has its own struggles, but sometimes can actually be really handy because there's no one there in the evening who gets annoyed with you if you're still doing work. And a lot of my family also doesn't live where I'm currently living, so there was quite little guilt involved in not sticking to regular 9-to-5 work hours. Plus, in my case, it actually worked out quite well, in as much as that I could actually quite flexibly decide on when I worked, and especially when I worked on my PhD, was really up to me and how self-disciplined I was. So it was quite easy for me to regularly have a long weekend. I only have a part-time contract, so that also enabled that. So for me, luckily, I actually feel like this variable that for a lot of people determines a huge chunk of their struggle in working on their PhDs, for me, not so much of a problem. So maybe before you start working on a PhD, or even before you start applying for a PhD, consider how it's going to work with your life. Do you have a strong support network that will help you out with your kids? Are you prepared to cut down on some other things and dig out some time holes, gaps where you can work on your PhD? Another variable that they talk about in this published paper that I found really interesting was that the job demands and the level of control that you feel about these job demands and your work in general as a PhD student also determine the likelihood of distress. Now, this one I feel like is a bit more relevant to me. I was lucky in as much as that I have a position at the university where I work. So I have a sense of financial security. It's not going to make me rich, but I don't have to worry about my funding running out. I'm not doing this in my spare time, whilst then even also having to coordinate some totally unrelated work. So I do think that worked out well. And maybe this is also something that you can consider. If you found a professor, for instance, who is willing to supervise your PhD, but you don't know how to fund it yet, I'm going to naively say, check out some funding options, apply to a lot of stuff. Even if it's not going to cover all your life expenses, it might still give you that little bit of peace of mind to cut down on what other work you are doing to pay your bills. The third variable that the article mentions as a variable that will predict PhD students' well-being is their supervisor's leadership style. Now, this is a difficult one because there's only so much you can do. You are a little bit at the whim and mercy of your supervisor, and of course, you know, I advocate speaking openly with your supervisor, but they are only human, and the way they choose to lead their department is to a large extent up to them and down to who they are as a person. So if you know that this is really, really important to you, maybe you can talk to other people that this person has supervised in the past, or who is currently working on their PhD before you choose to take up a job offer. I realize that's not always easy and you don't want to come across as overly critical, but I have found that some professors, especially if they are just confident in who they are and interested in finding someone who will always also be a good fit for their team, are actually quite forthcoming in that information, are sometimes even happy to give you contact information to other employees of theirs. And even if you can't glean this information and you don't have those contacts, maybe just check out previous dissertations that the supervisor has supervised. You might be able to just gather a tiny bit of information based on how long the process took. And, you know, if you generally find it interesting and you feel like, not just because of the leadership style, but also the type of research methods, for instance, that are implemented, you think that would fit well with how you would like to set up your PhD. Additionally, the research team in their article talks about a team decision-making culture being quite helpful for the happiness of PhD students. This is a difficult one for me personally, because one of the things I struggled with the most during my PhD was feeling really, really secluded and lonely. Our team decision wasn't bad because there were just very little things we had to decide on in a team. Most of the time it was me on my own, in my own head, and I can only deal with that for so long. So if you know that having a team that you work with is really important to you, look at the size of the department you're going to start working at, but also maybe seek out other options of graduate schools, conferences, meeting other people. I know that was sort of my attempt at solving that, even though that doesn't always work, just to find other pockets where I can talk to like-minded people, even though my work team is small to non-existent. Then, you know, you got to get proactive and find other people that might maybe fill that hole to a certain extent. And finally, the researchers did find that those PhD students that were aspiring to a career in academia were generally happier than those that weren't. Now, I do think this is a really important point to consider. I know that through a lot of the low phases that I experienced, the thing that kept me going and at other times made me doubt myself the most was whether or not I wanted to work in academia. Generally, I still think this is one of the most fascinating, wonderfully selfish places to work, because it's all about knowledge, and I think that is something that will always bring me forward. So because of that, I love the idea of working in academia, and that, even though sometimes not the best motivator, still keeps you going because there's a point to why you're working in a PhD. If from the get-go you are absolutely convinced that academia is not for you, then why bother with a PhD? It's not that much fun. Of course, there are arguments to working in non-academic fields and having a PhD. There's slightly unromantic reasons, like sometimes pay is better. But there are also definitely skills that you acquire whilst working on your PhD that are transferable and will help you out in a different field. But I would at least say a part of you has to be tempted at working in academia. Otherwise, it's a long slog, which can seem quite pointless. I don't think working on a PhD is pointless, but it can be painful and a long period of self-doubt. So if you need a break and you have to laugh and you have to feel like you have a kindred spirit, then I would recommend reading Notes on a Thesis. This is the English translation of a French graphic novel by Tiphaine Rivière. My French is a long time ago. This is a very whimsical, autobiographical story on her struggling to finish her PhD and how it ages her in the process, something I can relate to. And it's cute and it's funny, and I recognized myself in it so much, even though I'm not living in glamorous Paris and I am also not a literature major. But I thought this was great. Also a really cool gift for someone who is maybe struggling with their PhD or has completed it, because I waited until recently to read this, even though I've owned it for a very long time, because I wanted to feel a little more confident that I would finally finish my PhD before being confronted with so much biting humor about the process. So I loved this. And I also liked all the drawings and everything. It was very French somehow. I don't know, maybe I just say that because there's a lot of naked bums. So I'd love to hear what your process of working on a PhD is like. If any of you are out there, maybe just take some refuge in the fact that, you know, I've hated chunks of it, but I also am doing it in the hope that whatever I do next, I will love. I'll talk to you soon, that time maybe about a few books. See you soon, bye bye.